I was driving through the heart of America, somewhere in the Midwest, surrounded by miles of flat farmland and empty, open skies. It was one of those trips where the GPS assured me that I was on the right track, but every bone in my body told me I was hopelessly lost. It was close to midnight, and the highway was devoid of cars. Just me, my headlights, and a seemingly endless black road ahead. I hadn't seen a gas station, house, or even a sign for hours. Just fields, then more fields, and occasionally, the twisted remains of rusted cars abandoned on the side of the road. I tried to keep my mind off the isolation by listening to the radio, but every station was static. I flicked it off, settling into the eerie silence, and focused on the road. My car's gas tank was nearly empty, and my heart rate started to rise. There was nowhere to turn around, and nowhere to stop. All I could do was keep driving and hope to find some sign of life before I ran out completely. Then, a light appeared in the distance. A single, faint glow on the horizon. I couldn't tell if it was a gas station or just a reflection, but I didn't have a choice. I pushed the gas pedal a little harder, praying it would be something, anything that could get me out of here. As I got closer, the glow turned into the neon sign of a small diner. The place looked like it had been there forever, an old-style, retro joint that seemed out of place against the endless fields. It was the kind of place you'd see in a movie, faded red booths, a flickering sign that read Hank's Diner, and a handful of rusty cars in the gravel parking lot. I could have sworn those cars hadn't been there just moments before, but at this point, I didn't care. I pulled in, feeling a weird sense of relief. The diner was empty, but the lights were on, and through the window, I could see a waitress behind the counter, wiping down glasses. I stepped out of my car, stretching my legs. The air was heavy and thick, carrying an unsettling silence that felt unnatural. No insects chirping, no hum of distant engines. Just silence. When I walked into the diner, a bell above the door jingled. The waitress looked up and smiled, but it was a little too wide, a little too perfect, like she was hiding something behind it. She was in her 50s, wearing an old-fashioned blue dress and apron, her hair done up in a bun. "Welcome to Hank's," she said, in a sweet, honey-drenched tone. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Actually, I'm really just looking for some gas," I said, glancing out the window, hoping to see a pump nearby. She didn't answer immediately, just tilted her head and looked at me, her eyes unblinking. "Sure thing, honey. Just have a seat, and Hank will be right out." I wanted to leave. Every instinct told me to get back in my car and drive, but the empty road and my near-empty gas tank left me little choice. I sat in one of the booths, the vinyl creaking under me. The waitress placed a coffee in front of me. I hadn't ordered it, but I didn't mention it. As I looked around, I realized the walls were decorated with old photographs. Black and white pictures of people who looked like they belonged to another era. Some were families, some were couples, all staring straight into the camera with wide, eerie grins. "Locals?" I asked, trying to make conversation to ease my nerves. The waitress didn't answer, just nodded and smiled that too wide smile. Her eyes never left me. Minutes ticked by, but Hank never showed. I was about to leave when I noticed a figure standing outside by my car, a tall man in coveralls, holding a gas can. I let out a sigh of relief, figuring this must be Hank. I got up and headed for the door, but the waitress quickly stepped in front of me. "He'll take care of it," she said softly. "Just sit tight." I looked at her, confused. But when I glanced back outside, I saw Hank pouring gas into my tank. Something in me wanted to argue, but I was tired, and it seemed harmless enough. Maybe they just ran things differently out here. After a few minutes, the bell above the door chimed again, and Hank walked in. He was tall, with gray hair slicked back, and he wore an old, stained cap low over his eyes. His hands looked gnarled, like he'd worked with his hands his whole life. "All set," he said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. He didn't smile, just looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Thank you." I didn't see a gas pump," I stammered, feeling a strange tension in the air. "We're a bit unconventional," he replied, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. I fumbled for my wallet to pay him, but he shook his head. No need for that. We'll settle up another way. That made me pause, but before I could question him, he gave a curt nod and walked back outside. I looked at the waitress, and she just smiled, giving a small wave. I forced a polite smile, thanked her, and walked out. The feeling of relief I'd expected didn't come. Instead, a heavy dread lingered in my chest. I got in my car, the engine humming to life, and took one last look back at the diner. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The diner was gone. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the gravel lot was empty, and the diner, along with its neon sign and old cars, had vanished without a trace. My heart pounded, but I pressed the pedal, desperate to put distance between me and that strange place. I checked the gas gauge, it was full. I drove for miles, and soon the horizon started to lighten with the coming dawn. Relieved, I finally saw a sign for a small town. When I reached it, I pulled over at a gas station and asked the attendant if he'd ever heard of Hank's Diner. He gave me a puzzled look. There hasn't been a diner out that way in decades. Hank's Diner burned down back in the 50s. Whole family died in the fire. I felt a cold chill run through me as he went on. They say sometimes, folks get stranded on that highway, and when they're desperate, Hank's Diner shows up. But, folks don't always make it back. I got in my car, the full tank mocking me, and sped away from that town as fast as I could, never looking back. Mike had been a truck driver for years, used to long stretches of empty highways and nights spent with only the radio for company. But tonight, something felt wrong. He'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, hauling cargo from Denver to Chicago, and though he'd planned to pull off at the next rest stop, he felt an unusual urge to keep going. Maybe it was the faint static on the radio, like whispering, or the strange fog creeping in. He adjusted his rearview mirror. That's when he saw it, a man sitting in the back seat. Mike's heart stopped. He jerked the wheel, nearly skidding off the road, but quickly corrected himself. He glanced back at the mirror. The back seat was empty. Must be exhaustion, he muttered, exhaling a shaky breath. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel tighter. He pushed on, keeping his eyes fixed forward, refusing to check the mirror again. But after a few miles, curiosity overpowered him. He glanced back at the mirror. There he was again. The figure, slouched in the back seat, pale face half lit by the dashboard's glow. He wore a tattered black suit and had eyes that seemed to swallow light. This time, the man leaned forward. A voice as cold as the fog whispered, "Mike." Mike swerved, heart pounding, pulling his truck over to the side of the road. He practically threw himself out of the cab, stumbling into the night air, breathing heavily. His heart raced as he circled the truck, shining his flashlight into the cab. There was no one. Just the empty seats, the worn-out leather, and his bag on the passenger seat. He shook his head, desperate to convince himself it was a hallucination. Slowly, he climbed back in, locking all the doors. He turned the key, and the truck's engine roared to life. "I just need to keep moving," he said, glancing at the road ahead. But as he pulled back onto the highway, the radio crackled, and he heard it again, "Mike." The voice. He turned off the radio, the eerie silence somehow worse. Then came a soft rustling. Mike's skin prickled as he felt a sudden chill at the back of his neck, like someone breathing down his spine. He glanced in the mirror. This time, the man was right behind him, inches away, his eyes empty, staring through Mike as if seeing something far beyond. Mike slammed the brakes, but the figure didn't move, his gaze unbroken. And then, the man spoke in that same, hollow voice, "You left me." In a flash, memories flooded back, foggy, fragmented, but unmistakable. Years ago, he'd driven these same roads with his younger brother, who'd been hitchhiking to make it home. The two had argued, a brutal, angry exchange. Mike had abandoned him in the middle of the night, leaving him alone on that cold, foggy road. It was on a night just like this. The memory hit like a punch to the gut. His brother had disappeared that night, never making it home, never seen again. A pang of guilt twisted in Mike's stomach, but he didn't have time to think. The figure in the back seat reached out, a cold hand grasping his shoulder, tight and unyielding. The last words Mike heard were a whisper, cold and relentless, "I'm taking you with me." In the morning, a patrol officer found Mike's truck abandoned by the roadside, still running. The seat belt was stretched and twisted, as if someone had struggled against it, and the window was frosted over despite the warm air. No one ever saw Mike again. But sometimes, on foggy nights, truck drivers on that lonely stretch of highway swear they see a figure in a black suit standing by the road, waiting for a ride that will never come. Let me know if you enjoyed the story. Rachel loved the open road. Every Friday night, she drove 3 hours from her college town to visit her family in the countryside. The trip was usually uneventful, just miles of empty road and the hum of her car for company. But one night, as she drove through a narrow, winding stretch of road, she noticed something strange on her GPS. The usual route was marked with a detour she'd never seen before. Rerouting, the GPS's robotic voice intoned, instructing her to take a right turn into an old, unmarked road. She hesitated but figured it might be a shortcut and turned, letting the GPS guide her. The road was barely paved and lined with twisted, leafless trees that cast long shadows in her headlights. Fog began to drift in, thickening as she went deeper. Soon, it was so dense that she could barely see a few feet ahead. Her GPS screen flickered and froze. The voice on the GPS glitched, repeating the same line in a distorted voice, "Turn left, turn left, turn left." Rachel's stomach knotted as she looked for any sign of a way out. Just as she considered turning back, she noticed dim headlights approaching in her rearview mirror. Relief washed over her. At least she wasn't alone on this eerie road. She kept driving, glancing at the lights in her mirror for reassurance. But something was off. No matter how fast she drove, the lights stayed the same distance behind her, unwavering, keeping pace. Rachel felt a chill creep up her spine. Curious, and a little unnerved, she slowed down, hoping the car behind her would pass. But it slowed, too. She sped up again, and the headlights matched her, keeping that same haunting distance. Now her heart was pounding. She tried to make out the car, but the fog was so thick that all she could see were the beams of light piercing through the mist. "Turn right," the GPS droned suddenly, jolting her from her thoughts. She looked to the right and saw a side road barely visible through the fog. Without thinking, she turned, hoping to lose whoever was behind her. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror, she saw the headlights were still there, turning onto the side road, following her every move. Panic flared as she sped up, her fingers tightening around the wheel. She didn't know where she was or how to get back to the main road. The car kept trailing her, its headlights growing brighter, closer. Her heart raced as she heard something else, a faint, rhythmic thumping, like someone knocking on her trunk. Ignoring it, she kept her focus on the road, but the knocking grew louder, faster. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and to her horror, she saw a figure in the back seat, a man with dark, hollow eyes staring directly at her. She screamed, swerving the car, and nearly skidded off the road. When she dared to look back, the man was gone, but the headlights behind her remained, closing in. The knocking started again, this time sounding almost like a heartbeat. "Come home," a voice whispered from the back seat, so soft that it barely reached her ears. Rachel's hands were shaking as she tightened her grip on the wheel. She couldn't think clearly. Was she hallucinating? Was she just tired? She forced herself to look in the mirror one more time. The figure was back, his eyes burning into her. His face was twisted into an expression of pure rage. "Turn around," he whispered. With a trembling hand, Rachel veered off the road, slamming the brakes as she skidded to a stop. The headlights behind her stopped, too, just a few yards away, motionless in the fog. Her chest heaved as she sat there, frozen, unable to move, praying it would all disappear. Then the headlights began to slowly approach. But as they neared, they weren't headlights anymore. They were two hollow, glowing eyes. She looked back into her car, her heart stopping as she saw that the man had somehow moved closer, his hand reaching for her shoulder. Rachel screamed, throwing herself out of the car and stumbling onto the cold ground. She looked up, expecting to see a face, but found herself alone on the empty road. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a clear path back to the main road. Her car was empty. The man was gone. She climbed back in, her hands still shaking, and drove home without looking in the mirror once. She never took that route again. And sometimes, when she's driving at night, she checks her back seat, just to make sure she's really alone. Let me know if you enjoyed this one.